Hello, uh, I'm David Michaels. I'm honored to be here. This has been a fascinating conference so far for me. I'm an epidemiologist and don't get to spend much time with economists or uh, people interested in antitrust, so it's really been useful. And I think a lot of the things I'll be talking about are complementary to this because we talk a lot about conflict of interests and transparency. I thought it would be relevant that at least I put up my funding disclosures. Most of my salary comes from a university and then a foundation that pays the university for my time. But I also do some work in a couple of court cases, one involving asbestos and the other a big case where the state of Mississippi sued Johnson & Johnson actually for it was a products case, not a harm case, but for false advertising or not saying that baby powder actually included the possibility of asbestos exposure. I wrote a book, which a lot of this comes from, called Triumph of Doubt, which was my salary was mostly supported by foundations as well as the university in doing that. So here's the basic premise of what I'm talking about, which is the corporate disinformation about harms. And of course, we've been talking about regulation and markets, and I think it's pretty understood by many people here, but probably not the whole public, that the reason we have regulation, the reason we have laws is to protect people from harms. And that goes back to the early rules on the market of 1,000 years ago of fair weights, saying that private property belongs to an individual and they can sell it, but if they sell it, they have to actually advertise it correctly. They have to, if you're selling something that's supposed to weigh a pound, then it actually has to weigh a pound. And so there have been the need, essentially, the regulation provides a structure to have markets and to have private property. What I think we see now in many areas is, in terms of disinformation, that it's become standard operating procedure for corporations to create and disseminate disinformation by manufacturing. I'll talk about scientific uncertainty, but there's a lot of other uncertainty we could talk about as well, about potential harms caused by their products or activities. And so this would be to stop regulation from moving forward or to move to deregulate, which is another type of regulation, obviously. I think the best way to explain this in many ways is to think about the most successful campaign for scientific disinformation of the last century, which is that of the tobacco industry, which resulting in the killing of literally millions of people. So for many, many years, even before the science was definitive, people were hesitant to smoke cigarettes because of health effects, and the tobacco industry spent a lot of time and a lot of money trying to convince people that cigarettes were safe. And that was really not, and these two actually predate the understanding that cigarette smoking caused lung cancer. And we really only had the best studies on cigarette smoking causing lung cancer really came out in the late 1940s, really 1950 was sort of the seminal date. And the reason for that is cigarette smoking didn't take off widely, at least in the United States, until World War I, when soldiers who were sent to Europe were given free cigarettes. And so if it takes 20 or 30 years to develop lung cancer at minimum, then if you start smoking in 1919, for example, the earliest you're going to see lung cancer in those smokers is the late 1930s or 1940s. And even in 1950, it was still relatively rare. But there were well-known physicians who in the 1930s or 1940s were saying, lung cancer is a very rare event, and they would call their students over to see the case because lung cancer was so rare. And then World War II came. There was very little epidemiology that was being done outside of things directly related to the war. So after World War II ended, both in the United States and in the UK, epidemiologists looked at this growing rate of lung cancer, and they found that among people with lung cancer, they were far more likely to be smokers. That was the way the studies could be done at the time. And really by 1950, there became, 3 studies came out all more or less the same time saying, cigarette smoking increases your risk of lung cancer. And you didn't really need to debate it any further. But this really was like sort of a red alert moment for the tobacco industry, realizing that here they had a product that was, tremendously profitable. It costs almost nothing to make a cigarette. You could sell it. People are addicted, so there's really very little way that smokers can decide not to smoke cigarettes. And so the tobacco industry came together with a very well-known public relations expert named John Hill, formed from the company Hill and Knowlton, which actually had cut its teeth helping the chemical industry that was under attack for pesticides just before 1950. But anyway, Hill essentially said, look, you have to make science the issue, make the debate over science, saying, yes, we care about this immensely. We're going to form something called the Tobacco Industry Research Committee. And we're going to say, look, we're going to try to figure this out. And that really was a very, very, very successful initiative, and it kept regulation at bay for decades. Eventually, as you heard this morning, the great source of information about how these anti-regulatory campaigns work is the tobacco industry archives that were revealed as a result of litigation, and so you could really see exactly how that worked. The most famous of those documents, or one of the most famous, is this memo from a executive at the Brown and Williamson Tobacco Company that described exactly what they were doing, and what he said, that doubt is our product, since it's the best means of competing with the body of fact that exists in the minds of the general public. It's also a means of establishing controversy. It's fascinating to go look at how they argued this out in the materials that got sent out to different occupations, to the public, different countries. It's all there. This is one of my favorite. This was a newsletter that was sent out to physicians and scientists. The idea was to focus on anything else that caused lung cancer. So, as you see, lung cancer rare in bald men. So the basic idea here, this tobacco model, is now what we could see over and over and over again. I like to call this the Enronization of science, and I'm sorry for all the U.S. references in my talk. Obviously, it's what I know best. Enron was a company that was phenomenally successful. It was a company that looked like it was buying and selling energy and energy futures. It was totally a house of cards, but it was front page of the business magazines, how successful it was. It eventually collapsed. Many people lost their pensions. A few people went to jail, though not for very long. The basic idea of the product defense industry, and by the way, that term, product defense, is not my term, but actually some of these companies call themselves product defense. This is an industry that really came out of tobacco and now really has its own existence. It's scientists, and many of them work for scientific consulting firms. They're hired to defend products or activities in regulation, generally, and the legal arena. Same people. They will testify in front of congressional hearings. They'll put comments into agencies they're trying to regulate, and they will appear in court. And that's true in the United States and in Europe. The same. Some of these companies have branches in Brussels as well as New York and Washington. Their value is their ability to influence regulation and litigation. They don't provide valid science. They rarely do real science. What they do is they often will sort of write something called like a strategic literature review, or that's what I call it, where they'll pull all the science together and say, well, it just doesn't look like there's anything there, or there's too much confusion. Their science is really of questionable value. The thing to remember about these businesses is the business model is to produce whatever the product is that their client needs. And the client needs a study, a report saying, this substance isn't that dangerous, or there's too much confusion, or there's a level at which exposure is dangerous, but anything below that is safe. Whatever it is, that's what they do. That's their business model. If they didn't do that, they wouldn't be in business, because you as your corporation would go somewhere else to get the study that you need. And so I have a couple of examples. This is from the early days. This is Hill and Knowlton, which was a public relations firm. It sort of at the beginning, this was all done by public relations firms. Here was, I saw this memo because I was, during the Clinton administration, I was the chief safety officer for the U.S. nuclear weapons complex. I was Assistant Secretary of Energy for Environment, Safety, and Health. Beryllium was a very important concern. We had many dozens of workers with beryllium disease. The beryllium industry actually was approached by Hill and Knowlton that said, look, beryllium has a public relations problem. We can help you solve it, rather than it has a public health problem. It was a public relations problem. But they sent this example of their case histories, things that they had done for other industries, never mentioning tobacco, of course, but they really turned this into a very lucrative practice. This is, my favorite was around fluorocarbons and the ozone depletion. You could look at the beginning, it says, scientific allegations. So this is, we're not talking science, we're taking law, the legal question of allegation. Was the fluorocarbons released from aerosol spray cans were a threat to the ozone layer? This has become a cause célèbre in the media. There's no real scientific proof. And now I'm reading in the yellow, public concern and fear about the future caused fluorocarbon users to look to alternatives. Hill and Knowlton was asked by DuPont to help calm fears, get better reporting of the issues, and gain 2 to 3 years before the government took action. And so DuPont didn't want to lose market share, and they didn't. They were able to get a new product in. We got 2 more years of the ozone hole. There was no real, now you may recall the discussion around these fluorocarbons was all based on sort of modeling of chemistry in the upper atmosphere, but it was very impressive modeling, and no one really disputed it except for folks paid to dispute it. And not long afterwards, the folks who did that got the Nobel Prize, but that didn't stop Hill and Knowlton DuPont for delaying it for several years. So that's the basic model. Now you've got after tobacco elsewhere, and some of these firms really started to then market their services. This is one, the Weinberg Group that had an office in Brussels, they may still, for all I know, and the United States, selling themselves to corporations. Look, asbestos, tobacco, pharmaceuticals were all next. Scare science, and the second line is really key, the loss of presumptive innocence. And so that frame is something that, we think about. People who are accused of crimes are innocent until found guilty. They're presumptively innocent. And so they're taking that concept and then applying it to chemicals, the climate change, whatever you want to talk about. Until we prove it's harmful, we're going to say it's safe. And there's no reason to use that same frame. A chemical doesn't have the same rights as an individual charged for a crime. But that's the idea. And as long as they can frame it that way, they win. And of course, most of our laws require the government or an agency to show that the chemical causes harm before people are protected. And that's that concept of presumptive innocence. So to give you an example, how that argument goes around, diesel exhaust emissions are very difficult to study because people who live near roads, for example, or in places where you use a lot of diesel engines also have a lot of other exposures. So it's hard to figure out what's the effect of diesel engine exhaust. So a couple of different U.S. agencies launched epidemiologic studies done in underground mines where they were mining products that weren't particularly dangerous. And in underground mines, the pictures really are remarkable. These huge mining machines that claw, minerals from the walls, which are driven by diesel engines. So underground miners have a lot of diesel exposure and nothing else. And the industry, including engine manufacturers and the fossil fuel industry that makes diesel oil, tried to stop the studies. I have a whole chapter in my book about how they tried to stop the studies, but when the studies came out, they were pretty conclusive. That in fact, those miners were at greatly increased risk of lung cancer. That then triggered the International Agency for Research on Cancer, which is a branch of the World Health Organization based in Lyon, issued essentially a monograph saying that diesel engine exhaust is carcinogenic. And that then triggers other activities by regulatory agencies around the world. Sadly, none in the United States, but it still was very important to say that diesel engine exhaust could cause cancer. The industry responded in the traditional way. They essentially reached out to and hired many of these scientific consulting firms, and they started publishing studies in the peer review literature in academic journals that they control, essentially saying that's not really true. There's questions. Here's one, a critical assessment of the studies. Essentially, we look at all these studies, we don't believe them. Here's another one. Updated critical review. Then one of the rules we have in the United States is the raw data from studies that are done by the federal government or paid for by the federal government are available to anyone. It's sort of a transparency concept. So they were able to get hold of the raw data and they reanalyze it. And that's sort of epidemiological alchemy. You can turn a positive study negative very easily. I could make a lot of money doing that. You change the parameters around because you know what you're going to, you know what the data say to begin with, and you know what you want to find. And so they did this. They took the original study and they changed it around some and say, well, we don't really believe those exposure things. We're going to change them slightly. Anyway, over and over again, keeping saying that the result isn't there. There have been subsequent studies and actually additional years on those original studies. They all find the same thing. Diesel engine exhaust causes lung cancer. But that didn't stop the industry from spending quite a bit of time and money trying to say it's not there. Another example, these PFAS chemicals, a huge issue around the world, chemicals that are used to essentially protect materials, clothing, paper from both oil and water. Extremely effective. They last forever. They don't really break down, so they're often called forever chemicals. If you've seen the movie Dark Waters, it's sort of an interesting example where, again, DuPont was involved in this, where DuPont was sued by an attorney who now has become very famous, Robert Bilott. And there was an agreement that 3 epidemiologists chosen by the 2 sides of the case would then do independent studies and DuPont would pay for them. Fabulous example. It was really very unusual. One epidemiologist from the UK, Tony Fletcher, and 2 from the United States did this work as the largest study of sort of the effects of a chemical in water that I think will ever be done. And there were 60,000 people who were involved in this study. Essentially, it took them a long time to do the studies, but they found what they concluded were probable links between exposure and a couple of types of cancer, a couple of immunological diseases. A lot of these have been then replicated in animal studies. It's hard to do epidemiology on people exposed to PFAS, though increasingly we're seeing that as well. Again, we saw the same thing. The same companies that are hired by these companies that made PFAS. 3M was sued by the state of Minnesota because they contaminated the water with one of these chemicals. And of course, this is after all those studies are done. The experts who were hired by 3M concluded the epidemiological evidence does not support the hypothesis of a causal association. Of course, that's what they're going to say. Then the National Toxicology Program said, these chemicals are, we can presume they're to be immune hazards. We've got lots of studies that show that. A different consultant, these same companies, though Gradient, said the human-animal evidence does not support NTP's conclusions, so they should downgrade the hazard rating. Another one, Exponent, says the overall weight of the relevant epidemiological evidence is not sufficient to demonstrate causal associations. So you can see the theme here. So what happened? Well, even though 3M paid for one of these consultants to say there's really no effect, they eventually had to pay. They settled. They realized they'd lose in court. They paid $850 million to Minnesota and then just $10 billion to a bunch of other water systems for the same problem. The Environmental Protection Agency of the United States issued interim advisories saying that the acceptable level in water is 0.004 parts per trillion. That's essentially below the detection level. There is no, that's saying there is no safe level. 3M has finally said they're going to get out of the business of making it, but it's late. and this was from Le Monde. You may have seen it. Tomorrow, Stephanie Horel will be joining us, and she and some colleagues did some very important work looking at contamination within Europe, and there's quite a bit of it. It's also worth noting that the shareholders of 3M took a hit on this as well. The value of 3M dropped 50% over 5 years. No question this had a big impact on that. This was a time when the stock market rose. That's the top line there. The stock market went up a great deal, and 3M went down a great deal. So, of course, I'm an epidemiologist. I talk about sort of epidemiology and toxicology, but you can see these same approaches in other worlds as well. One thing we see a lot in terms of antitrust is there are economists who will only say that whatever the merger is that they're hired to predict the outcome, they will say it will reduce costs and no jobs will be lost, right? And they get more than $1,000 an hour. And of course, no one goes back and says, well, 10 years ago you predicted X and it turned out the opposite of X is what happened. But the reason this is important, and this is as true in epidemiology, in worker protections, environmental protections, antitrust, is when you make a decision around regulation, more regulation, deregulation, whatever it is, you need an evidentiary base to claim that your decision is based on, right? You have to say, we're not just doing this for arbitrary reasons, but it will be a good thing. There will be less harm. And so, the epidemiologists will say, well, we don't need to worry about PFAS. There's not really much harm. But these economists who will say, well, if you allow this merger to take place, there will be less harm. Everybody will be better off, right? This is one that really sort of blew me away when a law professor from Columbia saying that these what are called payday loans, which interest rates is 400%, were really a good thing for all the workers who need to borrow these loans, take these loans out. When there's a lot of focus of the U.S. FTC on Google. Google started hiring academics to write papers saying there really is no antitrust issue and monopoly issues around Google. And you can see the numbers of papers went up, which they paid for right when they were under scrutiny around antitrust. Then that went away for a while and the numbers went down. I thought this story is particularly striking, and this involved economists and sociologists, was Exxon, a company that comes up a lot around our climate crisis. You may all have no doubt read about the 1989 Exxon Valdez oil spill, which was at the time the largest oil spill. We've since done better, but an Alaska jury awarded $5.3 billion in punitive damages, saying that Exxon essentially should have controlled this, and they didn't. So more than just the actual harm, but the punitive damage for 32,000 commercial fishermen and Alaska natives, etc., harmed by the spill. So Exxon said, that's going to cost us a lot of money. We got to do something about that. So they hired at least 9 academics to provide research to show that jury awards for punitive damages were irrational and out of control. That was as that case was moving through the system. Bill Freudenberg, who I was fortunate to get to know before he died, was a sociologist. They tried to hire him, so he was able to write about it, exactly how that worked. And he didn't mention, he told me it was Exxon, but in his paper he didn't. But a large corporation facing a large judgment quietly provide generous funding to well-known scientists, including one Nobel laureate, who would submit articles to peer-reviewed journals so their unbiased science could be cited in appeal to the Supreme Court, saying these punitive damages are out of control. And it was actually very successful. Essentially, 90% of it, by the time it was over, was cost of their punitive damage was taken off the top. So the punitive damages were $500 million rather than $5 billion. So that was among Exxon's best investments, I think. So who pays for that, right? There are costs to all this for corporate disinformation. First of all, people whose health or well-being were damaged, right? That's the most obvious one. I like to show also that at least occasionally, it's not in the corporation's best interest to do this, because when corporations are caught manipulating scientific evidence to avoid regulation, they sometimes pay a price. and that's worth remembering. Now, they pay a price really because of litigation. It's rarely from the regulatory point of view, but litigation, at least in the United States, can be very successful in impacting corporate behavior. And we're starting to see that now in terms of the climate crisis, and there are lawsuits in many different venues, different arguments, saying that the fossil fuel companies have really caused a significant global problem, but it's affecting us locally, and they knew and they didn't do anything about it. So a couple of brief examples about this. Johnson & Johnson and baby powder, talcum powder can be contaminated with asbestos. A lot of talcum powder samples have been found to be asbestos because asbestos and talc minerally are very close, and they're often in the same mine. So if you mine talc, you often get some asbestos or asbestos-like fibers, and asbestos causes lung cancer and other cancers as well. So there are a number of lawsuits involving Johnson's baby powder. First, there have been, for the last 20 years, there have been many studies that found ovarian cancer is associated with use of talcum powder. There's a real scientific debate on that, a legitimate one. There are some big studies that did not find that, but there are plenty of studies that did. So these lawsuits started. In one lawsuit in Missouri, 22 women with ovarian cancer sued J&J. The jurors agreed, and they awarded the women $25 million each, or $550 million. But, and this was the sort of disinformation campaign impact of this, the jurors were given documents showing how talc firms and their trade associations were able to convince the U.S. government not to label products containing talc as potentially carcinogenic. And I saw these documents. I was not an expert witness on this, but I was asked to be a fact witness. I was the chair of the executive committee of the U.S. National Toxicology Program when I was in the government under President Obama. And then I continued, I was actually appointed by President Trump's Secretary of Health and Human Services to the Board of Scientific Counselors. So one of the things that was shown to these jurors was a document. At the time, this was long before I was on the Board of Scientific Counselors, but the NTP considered categorizing asbestiform talc as human carcinogen and non-asbestiform talc as reasonably anticipated to be a human carcinogen. The talc producers, and including J&J, hired product defense firms to oppose the categorization. And the memos, I was shown these memos in this testimony that I was made, and I was, my jaw dropped. Literally, they said the objective in our campaign here is to create a reasonable doubt in the minds of the scientists on the Board of Scientific Counselors. And the point was to come up with more confusion, and so the board would back off, and they did. There was also a great deal of political pressure, but for the jurors don't like disinformation. And when that stuff comes out, they get really upset. And so in this case, the jurors awarded the women $4 billion in punitive damages. Now that was eventually cut in half, but still $2 billion in punitive damages is a lot of money. Johnson & Johnson appealed, but that $2 billion is, they have to pay interest starting on the day of the award, and so they had millions of dollars of interest as well. So the Supreme Court turned down the case. They eventually paid more than $2 billion for this case. One juror told the press, we're just trying to find something Johnson & Johnson would feel. So I think it was effective. Johnson & Johnson is facing more than 50,000 lawsuits right now. They stopped selling talcum-based powder products and now sell cornstarch-based products, which they could have done 10 years ago or 20 years ago when this came up. It turns out that it's the scent that makes it smell like baby powder, and they could have moved to cornstarch 20 years ago. They've twice attempted to limit liability by creating a subsidiary, essentially offloading all the liability and then turning into bankruptcy. Twice judges have said they can't do that. So we'll see what happens there. Another example, I'm sure people here, particularly those interested in agriculture, are aware of glyphosate. IARC said glyphosate was a probable human carcinogen. So Monsanto, the company that produced glyphosate, launched a global campaign. They threatened IARC funding. They went to the U.S. Congress to get Republican committees to write letters saying, we're going to stop funding the World Health Organization's IARC if they continue along this path. They hired scientists to criticize IARC, to ghostwrite papers. Monsanto did this in a very secretive way. They tried to keep their fingerprints off a lot of the activities, so that all came out in court cases. Amazingly enough, with all that going on, Bayer decided to buy Monsanto. Not long after that, actually, the cases had already started, but lots of workers sued Bayer, alleging that they had non-Hodgkin's lymphoma because of their exposure. And that was sort of the disease that epidemiologists had particularly associated with glyphosate exposure. But the activities of Bayer drove the award, the size of the awards. The first case was a $289 million award, including $250 million in punitive damage. Another case, jurors awarded $1 billion each to a couple. Jurors were angry when they saw all of this, and all of these were reduced, but they still had to pay out a lot in awards, and there are now 20,000 lawsuits pending. So just going back and evaluating all of this, so Bayer was worth $87 billion in 2016, and then they purchased Monsanto for $63 billion. And so it's almost a merger of equals, but so the Wall Street Journal called this one of the worst corporate deals ever. In fact, last week when I looked, currently Bayer is worth $29 billion now, which is a third of its value. It's worth half of what they paid for Monsanto. And a lot of that is directly related to this. So then the question, so step back for a minute here, and this is a discussion I was having with Tom Lambert this morning. What do these scientists, what do these economists think when they're saying these things? Are they liars, or are they just sort of knaves that, people who sort of are willing to sort of look the wrong way? But what do they believe? I think something which you could call motivated reasoning drives this. It's the tendency to find arguments in favor of conclusions we want to believe to be stronger than arguments for conclusions we don't want to believe. And obviously, there's a reason you want, if your business is based on turning out a certain product, you don't want to think that product is wrong or is a lie, so you really strongly believe it. American sort of writer and politician famously said, it's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it. Or another way, I like to think the philosopher Cyndi Lauper said, money changes everything. If you're paying people to think a certain way, they do. And I know that I would be impacted if someone said, I'm going to pay you, $2,000 an hour to write this. I would try to be honest, but then, after a while you think, or if, let's say you're operating a laboratory and you get a very large grant from a corporation and you find something that you don't think they're going to like, and you think, well, if they cut me off, I'm going to have to lay off all my staff and do all these things. It has an impact on the way you think. I went to a website called Glassdoor. I don't know if you have that in Europe, where you could rate your employer and talk about your employer. And so I looked up some of these companies, and here's one where this is what sort of middle, lower level staff talk about their employer. Chemrisk, which is one of these biggest firms, said this is a law consulting company, not a science consulting company. Don't expect to be a scientist if you work here. Or Gradient, some of the principal scientists have questionable ethics and been called out for it. Or Exponent, sometimes you'll be working for the evildoers and trying to make it seem like they did nothing wrong. So they understand that. The people who are working there understand that. So corporate disinformation is used so widely and impacts really many areas. These just happen to be, clean air, clean water, opioids, obesity. These are areas that I wrote about in my book. A little shameless self-promotion here. But I think it has an impact not just on public health and on well-being, but I think it actually has an impact on science and how people think about science. If you've got dueling sciences all the time, people throw their hands up and say, well, yeah, and that's, we just don't know. We don't trust science. And certainly a lot of that has happened around COVID, which is a whole different discussion we should have. So what do we do? Okay, so I think it's important that the scientific community counter disinformation. And the public needs to be able to distinguish between real uncertainty, which is, there is obviously going to be uncertainty, from manufactured uncertainty. We need to build the scientific base for regulations, for deregulation, whatever it is, with research produced by independent, unconflicted scientists. There's a L got lost there, but I don't think that transparency, acknowledgement of conflict of interest is enough. I think you really have to have unconflicted scientists. And anyone want to discuss that later? I have lots of good examples why that is. So what is unconflicted scientists? I think we have to have a system where polluters and producers of hazardous chemicals, fossil fuel companies, in terms of the climate crisis, they should pay for the research, but they shouldn't control it. If they get to choose who the scientist is, what the methodology is, where it gets published, all those things, that will impact the outcome. And we need unconflicted science to be able to make decisions to help people. And so it's got to be done by independent scientists, paid by companies, but not under their control. And I think there are mechanisms to do that. There are models out there, but we really need to apply them. I also think it's really important in terms of the chemicals we think about to regulate toxic chemicals by class, not one by one. There is like 10,000 PFAS chemicals. We have reasonably good epidemiologic data on less than 10. We've got toxicological data on a few dozen, but all these other ones, we can't wait and say, okay, we're going to wait until we have good evidence on each one. We call that the body in the morgue method. We can't wait that long, so we've got to treat chemicals as a class, not one by one. And we have to end the presumption of innocence for all these harms. The chemicals in particular, they're not innocent until proven guilty. We have to think about very differently and think about the precautionary approach. And finally, and this is really the challenge to us, we need new solutions. We have to be bold and think about this very differently, because really this crisis is becoming worse. So thank you all so much, and it's great to be here.
Thank you very much for this fascinating talk. Yes, we do have questions. So let's take, please.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. I just have a question. If you could comment on the inequity of all of what you've discussed, because people from low-income countries, for example, they take all of the burden for the harm and also don't have the solution to litigate against those corporations. So I don't know if it's taken into account, for example, in the lawsuits in the US or...
No, it's the question. Oh, sure. You want to? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. You want
Thank you. It was really, really interesting. So I can tell you I have been working with the same topic and we have been tracking the scientific literature on chemicals and then connecting it to the affiliation of the authors to try to see we can see differences between research by academia versus research by corporations. And of course, I mean, the motivations are not so easy. There is very little that is comparable. And the reason is that firms or businesses research on things that are profitable, while academia researches on things that can have damage, because there is also a bias, that is the publication bias, correct? And then, of course, it then reduces the amount of things that can be comparable. But something that it's very striking that academia differs in terms of the type of studies they do, while corporations do research that follows the regulatory protocols much closely. And then it's not just about the science, but it's also that the science by corporations is also more likely to be taken into policy decisions because they follow the protocols, right? They are actually done to be accepted in the process. And that's something also very problematic, because much of the science by academia is disqualified because it's not based on the same type of protocols. So it's also a problem of what is being chosen later on in the decisions.
No, you're absolutely right. And look, the major chemical companies, drug companies, they have scientists and attorneys whose job it is to make sure they develop products that then can get through the regulatory system successfully. Daniel and I were just talking about, David, we're just talking about the classification of chemicals, and you can change molecules around to get them classified a little differently to get them through the regulatory system, of course, and that's their job. So we need to have a system which essentially pulls the science away from that sort of motive, because we need good science and we need new products and we need drugs that work, we need chemicals that work, but we also want to make sure that they're not harmful. In developing countries, it's a particular problem, and I've seen these same firms, Gradient, for example, there's a town in Zambia, Kabwe, where there are thousands of kids with high lead levels, and there are lawsuits there involving, suing a South African mining company, and the same experts who in the United States are saying that low levels of lead exposure don't really impact kids' neurological development, which of course is totally wrong, but they're doing it they're over there in Zambia saying the same thing. And it's even harder to find that information, it's much less transparent. And I don't know the answer to that, how you take that on, but it's certainly a huge concern. So these are very tough issues, but I think we really do have to think about them differently.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
Maybe I don't need the mic.
No, but for the people in the audience who are watching us, you do.
Yeah, I'm not able to ask to answer your question about economists. It's true that there are scientists who sell themselves, but I've seen something which you didn't touch upon that frightened me even more, and that was on the issue of soft drinks in the US and all this propaganda about if you do sport, soft drink have are harmless, etc., which has been completely disputed by science. And then I discovered in this documentary that was in fact edited by Arte in France and Germany, in Europe, that showed a special research institute funded by the companies to do research to defend their cause. Yes. And it's not academic, it's researchers which are hired for the purpose. And a guy who was a director and left it spoke in the interview and said this: I can tell you, I can be put on a TV debate with a Nobel Prize, I will win. I know how to handle a Nobel Prize to win my case. And essentially the argument is easy. He said, he will make a complicated argument, I will make a simple one.
Yep. Are we talking
I found really...
Are we talking about the International Life Science Institute? Yes, so I think we may hear more about that tomorrow. But there's a new book coming out also on their role in China, convincing the regulators in China to allow Coca-Cola to be sold widely. So I'm going over one last story. The sugar industry actually did many of the same things that the tobacco industry did in the 1940s, and it was actually in 1952 or 53 when tobacco announced this great new initiative. The former director of the Sugar Industry Research Committee wrote to tobacco saying, you need my help because we did this for sugar, and they hired him to help tobacco do this. So sugar has been doing this for a long time. The obesity epidemic is a global problem, and but industry has successfully put that off and convinced people that they are not responsible. So thank you all. Good luck.
Thank you very much. Thank you.